Okay, so yesterday we began learning this discourse on the first words of this week's Torah portion, the life of Sara. And the Zohar says that there are two things the Torah is referring to when it says the life of Sara, and then when it concludes again at the end of the verse, these are the years of the life of Sara. And the Zohar says that the first half of the verse is talking about how Sara merited to have supernal life, and the second half of the verse is saying that her life was hers. And we didn't know what that meant. We asked a question about the meaning of that, and we further went on to discuss in the other passage of the Zohar how Sara completed that which Noach and Chava attempted, and we wanted to know what exactly that means. So we started to explain that Chava began to work in the Garden of Eden, in Gan Eden, and Hashem told her to work and guard the garden, which the Talmud explains means to keep the 248 positive commandments and to guard yourself from transgressing the 365 negative commandments. And she was unsuccessful, and Noach was unsuccessful. And only Sara Imenu was successful in correcting that which Chava began. So to explain exactly what this means, we gave a few introductions, a few things we need to preface. Number one is that the service of Hashem is about davening, and the Alter Rebbe writes that davening is the chut hashidra. It is the spine that holds together the whole entire body. So too davening holds together the whole service of Hashem. And within davening itself, there are two elements. There is the meditation that we are meant to do during davening, and there is the pleasure we're supposed to have from that meditation. The meditation, God's greatness in davening, is meant to give us a great satisfaction and pleasure. And although it seems that the meditation itself is the source of pleasure, yet, as we're going to see, pleasure has a distinct source in the soul, not directly from the intellect. So, I get to set up over here in a second. Hold on. Yeah. So the pleasure that the soul has a distinct source. And to explain exactly what that source is and how that works, we began discussing the Gemara, which says that everything in the blade of grass has an angel which tells this blade of grass to hit it and says it to grow. And we began discussing how the various things we see in this world, everything has a divine origin. And it's because of its divine origin, because of its divine origin, that's why there's different properties and things in this world. So we said, for example, we find some apples are sweet and some apples are sour. And the reason why the apples are sweet or sour is because of where they come from spiritually. Sweetness comes from God's kindness. And although there's no comparison to the sweetness of God's kindness to the sweetness of the apple, yet one emanates from the other. We gave an analogy, just like in our own lives, there's different things which are called sweet, and although they're far beyond the sweetness of an apple. For example, the sweetness of a nigun, the sweetness of an idea. So although those items are far higher than the sweetness of the apple, yet all the sweetness of the apple develops from the levels of sweetness above it, and even develops and it originates from this chesed of Atzilus, that the kindness of Atzilus, that's the original source for the sweetness of the apple. Just like it says about Avram Avinu, that he said about himself that he was like ashes in comparison to a tree. Just like ashes are incomparable to a tree, although the tree is burnt and now the ashes remain, and therefore the ashes are of the same essence of the tree and they come from the tree, yet the ashes are very different to their source. So too, the sweetness of the apple, which is the ruchnis, so the gashmias, originates from the sweetness of Hashem's kindness, the Gashmis Shabaruchnias. Okay, that was another introduction. Then we gave an additional introduction. We started talking about the various kinds of pleasure we have from our senses. We said that although there is a clear pleasure we have from our intellect and our feelings, but the pleasure we have from our senses is far greater than the pleasure we have from our intellect and emotions. Our higher soul powers have a far more contracted sense of satisfaction and pleasure. And someone was asking yesterday about. It seems to say in Kuntrus Mind the opposite. It says in Kuntrus Mind that the highest level of pleasure is a pleasure of the intellect. So I would venture to say that maybe we'll reach further than Maamar, we'll get more perspective. I would venture to say that there's a difference between a higher and deeper pleasure and the word the Rabbi is using over here, which is what's the word that we're using? Revelation of pleasure. There's more revelation of pleasure. That means that you're able to enjoy some things, but they're not in a state of revelation. Like, let's say, for example, the pleasure of an intellect, it's a deeper and higher pleasure than the pleasure of a sandwich. But the pleasure of a sandwich is more pronounced, it's more conscious. It's kind of, perhaps this originates from the difference between the godly soul and the animal soul. The godly soul is called a poor wretched child because it only enters the body at the age of 13, while the animal soul is called the old foolish king because it enters the body at birth. And the animal soul is called not just old, it's called the king because it has the home court advantage. The animal soul is very at home in the body. It's not just there earlier on, it's also there in a more of a conscious, tangible way. The godly soul his voice is a lot softer. So yes, it's true when we listen to the godly soul, the satisfaction is a lot deeper, but revealed pleasure means that it's something which is very conscious and very touchy. So it's possible for parents to forget their child, God forbid, in a car on a hot day because they want to go eat lunch, even though the pleasure and the connection they have with their child is incomparably greater. But what's louder, what they hear, and what makes them forget about their child is the loud voice of the animal soul, which says, I'm hungry. So, okay, that's just an aside. And interestingly, another point I thought was very interesting was that the limited pleasure in the various senses, which is also, though it's greater than the pleasure of the intellect and feelings, but it's also a limited pleasure. It's the reason why it's called a limited pleasure is I don't know what the word is, but it's represented by the crevices and the cracks in the body through which these pleasures emerge from. The crack in the eye and the ear and the nose, those openings indicate that we're talking about a very contracted kind of pleasure. So, yes, it's a contracted pleasure. However, the essence of pleasure is indeed in the higher soul powers and intellect and feelings. Yes, it's the essence of pleasure is in the intellect and the feelings, but a more revealed pleasure is in the senses. Someone else was asking about the origin of pleasure. I didn't have a chance to look this up, but the Rabbi has a whole discourse about how a person should meditate about the pleasures of this world, and all the pleasures of this world merely come from that which the angels are unable to. The angels, the way it works is that every from a little less coherent than usual. It's because it was good for bringing yesterday. Anyways, there is a process of the spiritual cosmos and how things are brought to this world from the higher worlds. So it works in a similar way to our stomach, that the angels, which some of the angels are actually called intestines, they're able to receive some of God's light, Whatever is they're not able to receive because it's lower than them, they send that to the world beneath them. So the angels are basking in the pleasure of Hashem. And whatever is the nethermost part of that pleasure, which they can't enjoy, that's called Shomrei Hefanim. That's, so to speak, the excrement of the pleasure. And the excrement of their pleasure, the insignificant part which they're not able to enjoy, that is a source of all the pleasures of this world. So the Rebbe Marash actually connects this to the idol that people worshipped by defecating in front of the idol. Anyway, but the point is that all the pleasures of this world are from from that which is nothing compared to the real godly pleasure. Okay, but yes, all pleasure does come from the pleasure of godliness, and just it's been mutated and contracted and transformed and descended even into the realm of the unholy. But it all originates from there, and that's why the real pleasure is godly. Okay, now, continuing on this subject about the various pleasures we have from our senses and our intellect and feelings. So the advantage of our senses in regards to the pleasure our senses have is that there's a greater revelation again of pleasure in our senses. The pleasure in our intellect and feelings is very limited. Like the pleasure we have from doing an act of kindness is limited. The pleasure we have from intellect is limited. But the pleasure in our senses is great, and it's, for example, in the power of sight, a person could have a tremendous power, a tremendous pleasure in what he sees, to the extent that he could have kleis hanefesh. He could totally lose himself and lose his life through the pleasure he has from what he sees. That's a reason why there's a tremendous pleasure in the power of sight. That's why it's possible to totally lose yourself. This is what the Medrash means when it says that that the eyes of a tzaddik elevate to a very high level, and the eyes of the wicked, the opposite of a tzaddik, bring down very low. The tzaddik is able to be elevated through what he sees, and the rasha is able to descend very low through what he sees. As it says in the Talmud, the eye and the heart are two scouts of sin. The eye sees and the heart lusts. So the lust of the heart is because of what the eye sees, which is a tremendous lust. This is because of the tremendous pleasure we have with our power of vision. The same applies also to the sense of hearing. When you hear a sweet voice, you're able to get very excited in your very core of your soul with a tremendous pleasure. And it's possible that because of the sweetness you hear in a voice, you could also pass away, even more than the power of sight. The power of hearing a sweet voice can cause a person to lose their life, and that pleasure has even greater effect than the effect of the power of sight. This is because a voice enters into the crevice in the ear. What's the medical term for the crevice of the ear?
Ear canal.
The ear canal. And it reaches the udna deliba. It reaches the essence of the heart. So it goes through the ear, and it enters from the ear into the essence of the heart. So there in the essence of the heart, that's where the chiddush v'nefesh, the essence of the soul, resides. Although the desire and the pleasure of the soul are called transcendent, and certainly the essence of the soul is a transcendent power. However, and they don't have a special place in the body. The power of desire and pleasure aren't in a specific part of the body. They're transcendent. They're all over the body. But that only means that they don't have a unique, special place, that they're there in that place and not in any other place. But they're still attached to the body. The essence of the soul is also attached to the body. One soul is not unable to animate two bodies at the same time, because although it's transcendent, but it's still limited to that body in some way. So, where in the body are the soul powers of desire and pleasure attached to? Where is the essence of the soul attached to in the body? Yes, it's not limited to a specific part of the body, but it is attached to the body. Where is it attached to? So desire is connected, and its place is in the heart, and pleasure is the inner part of the brain. And the essence of the soul, the Yechidus Nefesh, its place is in the core, the inner core of the heart. You got that? The inner part of the brain houses pleasure. The desire is housed by it finds residence in the heart. And the essence of the soul, the Yechida, it finds its residence not the heart, but in the Pnimius Halev, in the innermost part of the heart. So, when you hear a voice in your ear and it touches your heart, that could draw you and your entire being together with this. The same is also regarding a power of smell. Power of smell has a tremendous pleasure. It reaches also the essence of the soul. We see clearly when a person faints and he's really out of it, how do you revive him? You revive him with a fragrance. This is because the fragrance reaches the essence. So too is this true regarding our power of speech. Power of speech also reaches the essence. Like it says in the Torah, my soul was expressed by my soul left me when he spoke. It's possible you hear someone speak and they just... I remember someone was once speaking in a shul and he really touched me. And someone complimented the speaker and says, you really knocked that guy out. He's pointing to me. Anyways, it's possible that you could really lose yourself. Actually, it was Rabbi Reitschik, Rabbi Reitschik, Rabbi Shimon Alevi Ben Leah,
Wonder how that fits with people losing their smell from COVID.
Interesting. Actually, it says in Chassidus that the reason... What is that? It says in Chassidus that our power of scent was not contaminated like other soul powers by the sin of the tree of knowledge. Power of scent is not contaminated, and that's why we're revived after Shabbos with smelling the psamim, because unlike other soul powers which are contaminated through the sin of the tree of knowledge, power of scent wasn't. Therefore, it goes straight to the soul, and the soul is able to bask in a pleasure that is reminiscent of the kind of pleasure that existed before the sin of the tree of knowledge. That says in other Pilush Chassidus. Anyways, so although the cause of although I'm listening and that's touching my soul, it must be that the speaker has expressed himself in his words as well. In order to reach the essence of my soul, he must have also spoken the essence of his soul. Like we see clearly that through speech alone, when you talk about something, you have a much greater pleasure than when you think about it. I remember once my grandmother, Zangazund, took my brother and I on a trip to a place the yeshiva didn't approve of so much. And I came back from this trip, and I wanted to tell one of the senior students how geschmack it was, how enjoyable it was. As actually it was Universal Studios. So he says, listen, it's one thing to enjoy, but you don't talk about it. You don't talk about it, because you talk about it, it stirs the pot. Anyways, so there is a pleasure that you get. There's a greater pleasure when you talk about it, more than when you think about it. The reason why there's more pleasure when you talk about something than when you think about it is because there is pleasure in the speech itself. It's not because when you do talk about something, there's now more pleasure because there's pleasure derived from your words. So all this tells us the great virtue of our senses, that although they are considered external and compared to our inner soul powers, and the whole purpose of our senses are for us to relate to the outside world. However, there is a time of atzmi, there is a pleasure of the essence in them which does not exist in the inner soul powers, the intellect and emotions. So, so this was not what I was thinking when I started today. This is a lot deeper than what I was saying. I was thinking that this is just more pronounced, more revealed, but the Rebbe is using a whole different word over here. The word that Rebbe is using is the essence eyes can touch the essence, the ears can touch the essence, the power of speech can touch the essence, the power of fragrance can touch the essence. It's not just that it's more pronounced, more revealed because we're more animalistic, we're more earthy. They're saying a whole different thing. They're saying that our senses touch the very essence of the soul, unlike the powers of intellect and feelings that cannot touch the essence of the soul. Further, we could add another point to this. This discourse that Rabbi said in Tafshin Chaf has a relationship to a Maamar that Rabbi said earlier that year in Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres, Rabbi spoke about how Pnimius Abba, Pnimius Atik, how the inner dimension of wisdom is connected and is one with the inner dimension of pleasure. So there's pleasure in an idea, because why is there pleasure through thinking about an idea? Because Pnimius Abba, Pnimius Atik, the inner dimension of Abba. Abba means the father, which means the power of intellect, the source of all other soul powers. The Pnimius Abba, the inner dimension of understanding of Chachma, of wisdom, is the inner dimension of pleasure. And further, the essence of the intellect is the pleasure. The way pleasure evolves in the spiritual cosmos is that pleasure becomes intellect. So the Chachma, I didn't learn that Maamar, I'm just going to guess what it means. Chachma, just like by a human being, our power of intellect is a window to the truth, but it's limited, because intellect, the way intellect works is that intellect tries to define things. Intellect looks at the 6 borders of a physical thing, or the 6 borders, the intellectual borders of something, and because it looks at how it's shaped intellectually, it places borders on it. That's how it defines and understands it. Intellect works by limiting things and crystallizing things and putting borders on things.
What are those 6 borders?
I don't know. It says just like the 6 directions, so too there are 6 spiritual directions with what intellect works with. And so there's a need that the mind has to define things when it wants to understand something. We can't understand something which has no definition, which has no limitation. So our whole way of our window to the truth is a very small window, versus Atik. Atik is a expression of the truth which is beyond all those limitations. So Abba, which is the very first step of the intellect, and especially Pnimius Abba, the inner dimension of Chachma, so that takes a picture of the higher revelation of Atik. So it later translates into an idea. It's kind of like when you see something, you're able to explain it in a different way. You saw something and you enjoyed what you saw, and now you're able to convey to someone else in intellect what you saw, but your intellect is not pure intellect. Your intellect is being tinted by your experience, by what you saw. So your power of pleasure in godliness, or let's talk about the divine power of pleasure, the Pnimius of Atik, is the reason why there's pleasure in Atik is because of the revelation of godliness, which is far beyond the revelation in Chachma. And yet there's something of that is translated into the realm of Chachma, similar to something that we are able to translate from things that we see into our minds. That's all conjecture. I should really look this up, and someone remind me to look this up. Okay, so the Rebbe's question is, here in the Maamar the Rebbe said earlier that year, the Rebbe is saying that pleasure creates intellect, and here on this discourse the Rebbe is saying that pleasure and intellect is limited. So why is that? Is it limited, or is the pleasure and intellect, the pleasure of intellect sourced in the pleasure of Atik? So the Rebbe answers, although the inner dimension of Chachma is the inner dimension of God's pleasure, but nevertheless, superficially, all that exists in Chachma, in the first sphere of Atzilus, is a mere ray of godliness in comparison to its source. So Yes, it is one with its source. If you were able to have if you were to have some microscope and to see the inner dimension of Chachma, you would see how Chachma comes from Pnimius Atik. But externally, Chachma is only a ray of godliness. So to explain this, the Rabbi gives an analogy of the difference between the power of pleasure and the power of desire. Pleasure is about you internalizing something deeply, deep within yourself. That's what pleasure does. Pleasure is about you have gratification within yourself. Desire is more about how you're expressing yourself and you're running after something. So when pleasure is revealed, which is not what pleasure is about is not about revelation. Pleasure is about you going into yourself and enjoying. So when that gratification, time to go. Okay, when that gratification is revealed, it's merely a tiny ray of what that pleasure is. And that's why we see that pleasure cannot rule over desire, and rather desire rules over pleasure, meaning that pleasure, when pleasure is revealed, which is not the place of pleasure. Again, pleasure is more about you going into yourself and enjoying. So when pleasure is in a state of revelation, it's merely a tiny ray of pleasure. But when desire is revealed, since desire is all about expression, desire is about going after something, so desire could be revealed with its with a full force. And that's why desire rules over pleasure, meaning that you're able to create pleasure out of things. You could say, I want this, and then when you say I want this, it makes you have pleasure from what you want, but you can't say, oh, I enjoy this, therefore I'm going to want this. It's the opposite. Your desire rules your pleasure. You could decide to enjoy something, and that will change your pleasure, and that will make you not listen to your pleasure. Because yes, desire is lower than pleasure, but the revelation of pleasure is only a tiny ray. Versus revelation of desire is the whole core of the desire. The whole essence of desire is able to be revealed, because desire is about you running after something. Pleasure is about you going into yourself. So when you try to take your pleasure and the expression of that pleasure is only a little bit of what pleasure is, and a little bit of pleasure doesn't dominate a lot, so to speak, of desire. So too, when we talk about the pleasure of the intellect, although the inner dimension of Chachma is the inner dimension of Atik, nevertheless, since the whole idea of pleasure is to go within yourself, therefore the revelation of pleasure in the intellect is only a tiny ray. And therefore the pleasure in the intellect is very limited. But the revelation, the essence of pleasure, where do we see the revelation of the essence of pleasure? Specifically in the senses, although they're external, although they're for the outside world, although they come through crevices and cracks in the body, but specifically in the senses do we have the essence of pleasure.